Morning Show. We're coming to you today on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am just delighted to welcome Ghlee Woodworth here this morning. Ghlee is a 12th generation Newburyport native. She's the author of the award-winning book Tiptoe Through the Tombstones about Oak Hill Cemetery. She's also the creator of Newburyport's Clipper Heritage Trail, a series of self-guided history tours. Ghlee was honored with the Distinguished Citizen Award for Beneficence to the Newburyport community in 2016 and was also the recipient of the Pioneer and Partnership Award from the Essex National Heritage Commission in 2017 for her contribution to Newburyport's local history. Clipper Heritage Trail Volume 1 was published in 2020, and Volume 2 was published recently, and that, I'm happy to report, is what she's here to talk with us about this morning. So, Ghlee, first of all, congratulations on Volume 2.
Thank you, Mary.
Making it to publication, and welcome to the morning show. Thanks for taking time to come here.
Thank you, Mary. It's been a couple years, I think.
It has been,
and thank you for the invitation.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. You are a repository of Newburyport's history. You're a living embodiment of Newburyport's history as a 12th generation Newburyporter. Well, Ghlee, please, let's start by having you talk to us about just how Volume 2 builds upon but differs from the tours in Volume 1.
Well, originally, this was only supposed to be one book. And it was a Friday evening in July of 2019, and I counted up all the images, and there were over 750 images. Gosh. And I thought, oh my goodness, I have to split it into 2 volumes. Yeah. So I took Volume 1 and I focused more on the downtown area. Yeah. Green and water and a little bit of High Street and State Street, the urban renewal story, how the downtown was saved. And then I decided I would do Volume 2 from Plum Island to Maudsley State Park. There's, again, another 9 self-guided tours. And the thing about it is, and I wanted to make sure of all my books with Volume 1 and the Tiptoe Oak Hill book, was that it's user-friendly in such a way that you don't have to read it by tour. You can just open up any page and begin to read. And for those who don't maybe care for reading as much, there's in Volume 2 there's 400 images to look at, right? And that help tell the story.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful because there's just so much history in Newburyport, and it's one of the things people value and really cherish about Newburyport. But a lot of it is hidden and unknown, and it's just a wonderful gift to be able to restore it to us. So I was hoping we might go through, I know you happily sent me the table of contents for Volume 2, and so I went through it and I just underlined and circled things that I was really curious about, and so I was hoping we might go through, and I will let everybody know this is a wonderful smorgasbord, and this is just a tasting.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Because we only have so much time on the morning show. But in the first one, which is called Along the Water's Edge, it starts up with the Great Fire of 1934, and I know nothing about this.
Right.
So could you talk to us about the Great Fire of 1934?
Sure. People know about the Great Fire of 1811, but as most towns and small cities, we had more than one Great Fire. In 1934, a fire started on the corner of Bridge and Merrimack. So if you visualize the kayak place.
Yes, right, of course.
Okay, and that whole area of boatyards, well, that was filled with buildings, including the very large building, the old Dodge shoe factory, which headquarters was up on Pleasant Street, but they also had this building here. The fire started and it spread very quickly through the waterfront, all the way up to Titcomb Street.
Oh, wow.
Yes, on both sides of the street. And fortunately, no one passed away in the fire.
That's
they were
remarkable.
Finally, yes. But John Legoulis, the late John Legoulis, who was in his 90s, who wrote some stories about Newburyport, he talked about living on Unicorn Street, which is now the Green Street parking lot along the Unitarian Church. And he and his parents were passing buckets of water up to his younger brother, and the younger brother was up on the roof, and they were throwing buckets of water to contain the embers from the fire at the foot of Market and the foot of Green, and on the other side to contain that fire. So it destroyed dozens of buildings, but fortunately there was no loss of life. There was over $1 million worth of damage.
You know, it's always a useful reminder it's what a danger fire was earlier. I mean, imagine having to put a big fire like that out with buckets of water.
Right.
It's unimaginable. So it seems like it's miraculous that no one's life was lost in that fire.
Well, the same thing with the Great Fire of 1811. It started on N Street in a stable. There were over 200 buildings destroyed.
I remember
But
reading
again,
about that.
no loss of life.
Yeah.
Yeah, very
So-
fortunate.
Well, anyway, so that's just a taste of one tour.
Right.
Tour 2, shipbuilders and shipyards.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about that just because I think it's hard for us today to get a sense of just how predominant shipbuilding was. I mean, we're the Clipper City, but it's not something that's taken place here recently. So on tour, there's a number of shipyards, the Manson Shipyard, Courier Shipyard, so many. Could you just talk a little bit about how dominant shipbuilding was back in the day for
Yes.
Newburyport and what made it so important?
In the really late 1600s, as the first settlers down on Parker River gradually moved up this way, there were the farmers, and then there were some of those who wanted to pursue water-related activities and business adventures. So here comes the shipbuilding, which made sense.
Yeah.
And so from the late 1600s to about 1900, Newburyport constructed about 2,000 vessels.
Wow.
And our shipbuilders were known all over the world. This is how talented these folks were. We rivaled Salem and Boston. The investors of ships, because ships weren't just owned by one person, they were owned by several to many. An investor might invest into 1/8 of a ship, of a ship vessel. And we had investors from over in England, over in Europe, investing in our ships. And as soon as they heard that John Currier Jr., who was well known and respected around the world, was getting ready to construct, or they actually requested John Currier or some of our shipbuilders. They were well known. Eben Manson, now in the area of the North End Boat Club. He was well known for his schooners.
Yeah.
And even Essex and Gloucester folks, the fishermen, would come up to Newburyport for his schooners. That's
Wow.
how respected he was. So there was Currier and Townsend and John, and again I mentioned John Currier, built about 100 ships on the Merrimack River. We were bringing in hundreds and thousands of dollars of merchandise from all over the world. But you have to picture, as we have problems with our mouth of the river,
Yes.
of how shallow that is. I
Yes,
think
that's right.
at the highest tide, it might be about 14 feet.
Many a shipwreck.
Yes, yeah, 14-foot clearance.
Yeah.
The same back then. So often, most of the time, those large ships on Upper Merrimack Street were towed down below the bridge, which was built in 1829, and the railroad was 1840, and they were being rigged down below the bridge. So the waterfront area, and especially Cushing's Wharf, was a rigger's wharf around the starboard galley area.
Yes, right.
And they were rigged. Then most often they were towed to Salem or Boston because they did not have the weight.
Okay.
They didn't have the ballast.
Yeah.
They were towed. Otherwise, they put up sail and they get blown across the ocean.
Yeah. Which would defeat the purpose.
Right. And Margaret Cushion writes about this in her diary, that most often they left and they were never seen again in Newburyport because they were too heavy with cargo to cross the mouth of the river.
Yeah.
And so they had offices in New York and in Boston and Salem. So this was a huge economy for Newburyport. You had the shipping, and then eventually the shipping starts to decline a little bit, and then here comes the comb factories, the decorative combs, and then the shoe factories and the cotton mills.
Interesting.
And that
Yeah.
became the industrial age. The city railroad came in on the waterfront, so the shipping started to decline.
Yeah.
And then the factories, the shoe factories, eventually they left town around the 20s and 30s. And after World War II, as many communities were really struggling with local
Yeah.
economy.
Well, it's really one of the things I like about learning more about Newburyport's history is it's like layered holographs of what's here now. Of course, looks very different, but it's really intriguing and engaging. And to picture what you just described is the evolution of manufacturing in Newburyport and the evolution of our economic
Yes.
subsistence. And so I think that's just fascinating. Thank you for that.
Right.
Well, a third tour is around the Frog Pond.
Yes.
And I love Bartlett Mall is one of my two favorite parks in Newburyport. I go with my dog just about
Oh, okay.
every day. So I love
Wonderful.
Bartlett Mall and the Frog
Wonderful.
Pond. And I recently learned that the beautiful, wonderful LA at Bartlett Mall, right along High Street there, was designed by Charles Eliot, who founded
Yes.
the trustees. And I worked part-time for the trustees at Castle Hill for
Oh,
a number
sure.
of years. So I'm familiar with Charles Eliot in that sense. And so I would really love to learn more about Bartlett Mall and the Frog Pond from you.
Well, certainly in the 1700s, it had a diverse use. There was a potash house for wood ashes. There was a windmill. There were hay scales. And there was probably one of the first rope walks. John Crocker, who had a narrow building to where about the courthouse is. And a rope walk is... it was a large building, and this is where the men would take rolls and rolls of jute, and they would weave and make cordage for the ships and for the fishing vessels. And so when they did it, they were walking 100 yards or 300 feet in these long buildings, weaving. This,
Braiding as they walk.
Braiding, yes, weaving and braiding. And so that's where the
wow.
name rope walk comes. And we had many, 7 or 8, and several were down in the South End,
Yeah.
in the Joppa area. So that was very important in Bartlett Mall. There was also the area along Pond Street now, the open area,
Yeah.
where was the training field for port militia companies in the late 1700s. So it's been very, very important over the years. And then eventually Nathaniel Tracy, he planted trees in 1799, and then 1800 Captain Edmund Bartlett donated monies to help with the design to reflect the promenade similar to the Pall Mall, the Pall Mall.
Yeah.
And the Mall is pronunciation in England. Pall
Yeah.
Mall. It was in England. And people say Bartlett Mall or Mall. And Mall is the English pronunciation.
I watch BBC shows a lot,
Yes,
so I've
and
heard
so
that.
yes, it's the pronunciation. Yeah,
Yeah.
because some people say, "Well, where's the mall?" Thinking,
Yeah.
"Where's the mall? Where's the mall? Oh,
Where's the
mall?
mall?"
Where's the mall?" Right. And so eventually, there was more design, and as you mentioned, the mall, the Mall Improvement Society hired Charles Eliot to assist with upgrading the design. And so what we see today is basically when the late 1800s.
Yeah.
And so there's a huge effort now. I think it's about going to be pushing $2 million to finally solve the problem of silt and algae buildup.
Yeah.
And Chuck Griffin and a lot of folks are heading that up. So that'll take
Yeah.
a multi-year project, but it's going to happen. It's going to be beautiful once it's
I'm
completed.
sure it will be.
Yes.
A worthy project.
Yeah.
The geese are really enjoying what they have there now.
Yes,
I must say.
yes. Yeah, they're ducks too. Have you seen ducks?
They
usually come
in,
flying
they
through.
go, but sometimes there's a lot of them there, which
Yeah.
is exciting for my dog. Well, the other thing I wanted to ask you about in 2 or 3 around the Frog Pond was that Guinea Village.
Yes.
Because I've heard Cabria Baumgartner talk about that.
Yeah.
And who knew that there was actually an African-American community in Newburyport. So
Right.
could you talk a little bit about that as
Sure,
well?
I became aware of it several years ago. And I did some research, and of course, about Guinea Village. And Guinea is named for the West African country, and that was a nickname. And I was very sensitive when I was writing, as far as, is it okay to say Guinea Village? Guinea, was this just only Newburyport only?
Yeah.
But Boston had a Guinea Village. And this
Yeah,
was a
okay.
common that obviously white folks named the neighborhoods of African Americans Guinea for their ancestral home in West Africa. So, that said, yes, along Auburn Street, where the old jail is, and on the if you go down on the left is Old Hill Burying Ground. And you see that on the old maps. You can see that in Volume 2 with the maps. You go down, and then you have to visualize that Route 1 was not there until the 1930s. Route 1 bypass.
Yeah.
That highway wasn't there, and then the road continued down to Low Street under Guinea Bridge.
Okay.
And I remember years ago, people would say, "Well, is that named for Italians?" I said, no, Guinea is for West Africa. And so the maps show that there were black families there. So I've done research, and Cabria, Dr. Baumgartner has, and that was several years ago. I did identify grave sites in Old Hill. A couple of them were more well known, and I've identified more across the street in Highland Cemetery, and I do African American tours for the grave sites. So this was an area. Some of the blacks did own their own houses. Andrew Raymond, who married Celia Owens, who was brought up as a slave by the Hale family up at Mount Royal, which is now home of Newburyport High School. She married Andrew, and they were all working in the community. And I think people don't realize how small the community was. The census, maybe 100 black folks in the community, which is not that many. Eventually was down to about 50. But this whole area and on Pond Street, there were black families located there, but there were black families up on Johnson Street. Warren Street, Market Street. So they were spread throughout the community. And what I was happy to discover when I did research, there is a small section of black folks in Old Hill Burying Ground facing Auburn Street. But when I went across the street to Highland, I found about 10 or 11 graves. And they are spread across 200 yards.
Wow.
There is not one section. And their burials started mid to late 1800s.
Well, I think that most people probably aren't even aware that there was a black neighborhood in Newburyport. And so I think it's important to fill in those chapters of history because it makes it both truer and adds a context that only enriches our sense of Newburyport's history.
Right. And I just want to mention that Jody Vining in the planning office and Dr. Baumgartner, Cabria, and we are working on interpretive panels that feature black residents in town. And we had some, and folks visiting high profile. Frederick Douglass back in 1829 as a young man, and Booker T. Washington came through, founder of the Tuskegee in 1880s and 90s. He came through. His son was going to Governor's Governor's Academy. And then Malnea Jones Cass was here in Newburyport as about a 9-year-old for a couple years, and I found her school records at Kelly School Records.
Kidding.
Yes, and I write about her. She was under the guardianship of the Smith family, and down on Unicorn Street, and the Smiths also worked at Wolf Tavern.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes.
Well, I wanted to go to tour 5. Again, I'm following my favorite
Sure.
places in Newburyport, Bound for 3 Roads and Beyond, because that's where you talk about Atkinson Common.
Yes.
My other favorite park in Newburyport, where I also go with my dog all
wonderful.
the time. And I know, of course, there's a Civil War memorial there.
Yes.
But I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about how Atkinson was founded and how that Civil War memorial came to be.
Right. We're so fortunate in Newburyport. The size, square footage of Newburyport is really very small, but our over 20 parks, how fortunate are we? And so much of it is because of the benefactors. And we are just so fortunate of people giving back to the community, and some of this is the land. And one of it, of course, is Atkinson Common, which was absolutely is beautiful, and we had benefits of Eunice Atkinson Currier, who gave this chunk of land in memory of her dad. Thank you,
Thank you.
Eunice. Oh my goodness.
It's a tiny jewel of a park.
Yes. And then eventually the Belleville Improvement Society was founded in the 1880s and 90s, became very active, and still is, looking over Atkinson Common and improving it and so forth. And then the beautiful Civil War statue, the Volunteer, was commissioned, and Atkinson Common was chosen for that place. And then William H. Swayze, who still lives on today. He and his wife Susan were benefactors of the YW, benefactors of Atkinson Common, and the Swayze Fund in the schools today provide training for the teachers, and with the help of George Tilton, who designed the War Memorial, for only $4,000 back in 1902, and they dedicated this whole area for area war veterans.
Wow, yeah.
And very, very fortunate, and certainly please, if you've not gone to Atkinson Common, and take a walk and absolutely look at that war memorial. It's very, very beautiful, and there were hundreds of people there on that day of dedication.
Yeah, and it's always, I will often pause to read some of the names that are inscribed. There are veterans, and even people who have seen the Civil War Memorial may not realize that on the back side of it is the Gettysburg Address.
Yes.
Which I will often stop and read, and it brings me to tears just about every time, and it's something we'd probably benefit from all of Americans reading that every day.
Yes.
Just as a reminder
Yes.
of what it's supposed to mean to be an American, and of how, I actually will salute the soldier and say thank you.
Wonderful. Yes,
Bill Hallett influenced me.
Yes,
in
Bill.
that.
Wonderful.
He was on the
Wonderful,
show a
isn't he?
couple of times,
Yeah.
and he talks very eloquently about how much we owe to the soldiers who died in order to save our republic and keep our
Absolutely.
democracy.
And we had a
So-
lot of Newburyport, Newbury, and West Newbury boys who died fighting for this country. And fortunately, we did have some come home, but just had a phone call from Kansas, from Sean Moriarty, who was looking for Joe Couliard, and he was a Newburyport boy who died at Gettysburg.
Wow.
And buried on the field, and he wanted to confirm that he was buried, as hundreds were on the field, but his family has a stone for him at Highland Cemetery. So we're very fortunate to have those boys. Right.
Now, I have to ask you, because in the description of that tour, Wonder Woman is mentioned. And so I must find out, Ghlee, what is the connection of Wonder Woman with tour number 5?
Yes, Newburyport. This is an example, because a lot of times people will ask me, well, how do you get ideas for what you write? And because I have a nice small library. But I learn a lot I always have from the beginning. When my first tour in 2006 is people throw out names, or have you heard about this? Do you know anything about this? And through my reading, and a friend mentioned, she says, I'm reading Dr. Jill Lepore's book on Wonder Woman. Oh. I said, oh. She said, do you know there's a Newburyport connection? I said, no, I did not. And she says, well, I'm going to give you the book after I finish reading it. And so here's the connection, Moulton Castle. Do you know where Moulton Castle
I do
was
not.
located?
No.
There was a castle located in the now area of Maudsley State Park.
Oh,
And it's the area closer to the water.
okay.
Okay? And here's, I'm just going to, right here, you can see it up on the hill.
Yes.
There's Moulton Castle. Well,
Okay.
Henry Moulton, he was a student of architecture, long
Okay.
story short. And he was a descendant of the Moultons, the famous Moulton
Yes.
silversmiths in the late
Yeah.
1600s and through 1800. Okay. Had many children. His grandson, very bright guy. He was Dr. Edward Moulton Marston, and he lived from 1893 to 1947. And he had a PhD from Harvard in psychology and taught at Tufts University. And he was married to his wife, Elizabeth, and he also had a domestic partner, Olive. And they were all, yes, and this is back in the 30s and the 40s.
They were advanced.
Yes, they were advanced. And he was on the board of DC Comics. And Elizabeth and Olive and Edward just talked, and they realized there wasn't a strong woman figure in the comics. And so they together, he certainly gets all the credit, but together they create Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman is based on his wife, Elizabeth, and his partner, Olive, who are very bright, strong, independent women.
This is a great story.
Yes.
Why
Yes,
do
it is.
we need to know this?
Yes, and Edward, as a toddler, was running around Moulton Castle.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So there's the connection, right? And so from there, I'm not going to tell too much more, but
Yeah.
that's the connection.
Right,
And so
wonderful.
thank you, Dr. Marston, for creating, and Elizabeth and Olive for creating
right.
that strong woman
Right.
that was needed.
We've
Yeah.
got to make sure that Elizabeth and Olive get included in
Yes,
that creation story,
absolutely.
which just strikes me as worthy of a Marvel comic all by itself.
Right, right.
Well, there's just one more tour
Sure.
I'd like to ask you some highlights about, and that's the one to the sea, because you go out to Plum Island on
Oh,
this tour.
okay.
And there's so much there, I
Yes.
know, but there were two things I was hoping you could comment on. One of them is, because it's really important, the life-saving service
Yes.
that was there, and then, if you would, Camp Sea Haven,
Oh,
which
thank
is a
you.
different kind of story.
Thank you. Well, the life-saving service was the early organization for the Coast Guard, basically. And certainly because we had a lighthouse and we had over 100 shipwrecks in the Plum Island and Salisbury area. And so there were 3 life-saving stations constructed, one out what's now the Wildlife Refuge area
Yeah.
in the middle of Plum Island, and then one down on the point down towards the mouth of the river. And they were equipped with dories and life-saving equipment. And as soon as they saw a boat struggling, they were able to row out and actually shoot kind of a life-saving spear out to
Yeah.
the boat, and were able to save dozens and dozens of lives. So all coastal communities did have a life-saving service, and eventually that became the forerunner of the Coast
Yeah.
Guard. Yeah. So that was our life-saving service. And Camp Sea Haven, I just dropped off 20 books to Anne Harrington Lagasse. And back in the 1940s, her grandparents, a neighbor, a friend spoke to her grandfather and said, gee, you know, the children with polio, they don't get to go to summer camps.
Yeah.
And so the Harringtons created Camp Sea Haven down what's now in the Wildlife Refuge. They used the actual Knobs life-saving building for part of their camp. And they welcomed hundreds and hundreds of children from the 1940s to 1971. and it was just freedom. It was pure joy for those children down at Camp Sea Haven. You can imagine some of them certainly were in braces, some with crutches. There were a few in wheelchairs, but many of them spent the entire summer down there. And there was nothing but fun. They had a saltwater pool, but they also were able to get down on the beach. And years ago, the late Mike Bulger and I met with Ann Lagasse over a couple breakfasts, and we had an idea of getting a slideshow together and then also a reunion. And several years ago, we had a reunion down at the Newbury Fire Hall, and it was incredible. Her father, eventually her parents took over. Ann and her brother and sister grew up down at Camp Sea Haven during the summers, and there was a reunion. Her dad was still living, and he remembered every single counselor's name and every camper who walked into that hall.
Oh, that must have been so moving.
My goodness. It was just incredible. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful time. And, of course, I thanked Ann for sharing this story. Charlie, her son, created a documentary also. We did some slideshows, and now it's in the Trail Volume 2, and so Camp Sea Haven will live forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was such a beautiful, generous, wonderful, loving idea to create this camp so that these kids could have the same kind of fun, beachy summer camp experiences that other kids did. It's such a beautiful story.
Yes, it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Really
so many
is.
people don't know about it. So you definitely want to learn about Camp Sea Haven.
Absolutely. Well, Ghlee, it's, you are such a repository and such a guardian of Newburyport's history, and it's just wonderful to have it all recorded. It's only fair to ask you, though, under the heading of probably like asking you what your favorite child is, but do you have a favorite? Maybe not tour, but favorite site? Clearly, Sea Haven is one of them.
Yes,
the way
Camp
you
Sea
brings
Haven.
up the emotion when you talk about it. But is there something that you just really find joy in visiting yourself or making sure that people know about?
Wow. There's over 200 stories.
Yeah.
Well, like 220 or 30 stories in my 3 books. Definitely certainly the women that I've been able to find, the teachers, Jane, and then the stories that we're, every day, every week, we're continuing to research on the Black community.
Yeah.
So some of those the stories, there are some tough readings with Celia, one of our Black citizens, but boy, she made it. She made it through and ended up running a boarding house on Titcomb Street. Schofield Baptist, another Black member. Ethel Reed, who was a brilliant young graphic artist in the 1890s. She had her posters on newspapers and magazine covers, and just sadly that life kind of got in the way, and she goes to England and passes away in her 40s. Tamsin Donna, Eustace Donna, who grew up on Milk Street. She ends up marrying George Donna and travels by wagon train. And the resources and the books that I use to tell the stories. In Tasman, I thought, Tamsin, how am I going to get this story out with the highlights? And I read about a gentleman, I forget his name. He was a doctor out in PhD professor, and he wrote a book all about the Westward Ho, the whole pioneer life. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've got to get this in somehow in a few paragraphs, because we New Englanders don't know anything about crossing the prairie, right? And the Donner Party gets stuck in the Sierras. So it's hard. I do have a lot of favorites, but definitely the women and the Black community that I've been able to uncover there. The work, Ann Withington, the work that she did to get the women's vote out. In 1921, we had 2,000 women vote in a presidential election, and the work that they did
to make that possible.
to make that possible.
Absolutely.
So that's a few.
Well, Ghlee, thank you so much, both for preserving and animating Newburyport's history, and thanks for visiting this show. The
Absolutely.
final important question is to ask you. So, how can people get a copy of the book or learn more about it?
So directly from me,
Okay.
and I'm in the old-fashioned phone book, or Google, and my number is 978-462-2010, and I deliver.
Okay.
I deliver, absolutely, at this last minute. And so that way, or email me at tiptoethroughthetombstones@yahoo.com. And the Museum of Old Newbury also has my books.
Excellent.
Right.
I can't thank you enough. It's always fun to talk to you, Ghlee. Thanks for taking time to visit the morning show. It's such a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to learn more about Newburyport's history, and you really have a gift for bringing it alive and sharing your passion for it with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary, and congratulations to you. And thank you for having this show.
Thank
It's
you.
wonderful.
Well, thank you.
A
Thanks
community
so much, Ghlee.
asset.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today's show, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, be well.